Hi there, everybody. My name is Nate Ridgway, and I am a teacher in Indianapolis, Indiana. So I'm taking some time here to do a re-recording of our session for ELCC 2020, just because of a few technical glitches and some other issues that we had going on during our session. Now this session is Don't Ditch That Tech, Differentiated Instruction in a Digital World. My name is Nate Ridgway. I'm going to be guiding you through this presentation. Maybe you weren't there, or maybe you just like to watch it again. But we are going to be doing a whole bunch of different things here that are going to be revolving around the idea of using technology to differentiate for our students and to better meet their needs. So a couple things to note here. Number one, you can pause this recording at any time to watch it at your pace. Second, to make things more accessible, just because I try to practice what I preach, I'm going to turn on the captions here so that you have access, for example, like you might be deaf or hard of hearing. Second, if you would like to look at the presentation that I am doing here, that is down there in the bottom left-hand corner. You can see a bit.ly. It's a bit.ly/ELCC2020. And that is case sensitive, so you will need to type that in correctly. Just please be aware that some of the links that I have in here, specifically for Pear Deck, will not be working just because that was something that we were doing at the time of that particular session. Other than that, we're ready to get started, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into things. So my name is Nate Ridgway. I'm a teacher in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm actually a history teacher who kind of started out as a special education teacher, and I've really taken the time to, over the last 4 or 5 years, to really merge the worlds of ed tech, UDL, and just a whole bunch of other passionate, nerdy things that I'm involved in. Kind of where I'm at right now is I am the most, I'm one of the co-authors of the most recent Ditch book, if you're familiar with the Ditch book series by Matt Miller. And so I co-authored the book Don't Ditch That Tech, which is what this presentation is named after. I also do some blogging for Q, if you're familiar with their work out in California, as well as a co-host of a podcast for new teachers called Make It Till Friday. So all the links to that can be found here, but all that aside, let's get going on to the good stuff. So what we're here to do today is to, first of all, just kind of get a working definition of differentiation that we can kind of go along with. And then once we do that, then we'll be talking about 4 areas. In our particular presentation, we only did one of these areas just because, for the sake of time, I'm going to be attempting to do all 4 here. Okay, so let's carry on and we will get going. Okay, so let's get on, first of all, the same page. We're going to be taking a moment to define this thing called Universal Design for Learning, as also known by its acronym UDL. And this is really going to be our foundation. Before that, though, I have this beautiful slide of mannequins because I am terrified of them. And I think for a lot of teachers, as soon as we start throwing around these words like UDL and differentiation, stuff starts to get really, really scary. And for me, I know as like a beginning teacher that differentiation was like, oh my gosh, I have to make how many different versions of this lesson plan and all of these things. And it was really, really intimidating for me. So anyways, mannequins aside, let's carry on. Let's talk about what this UDL thing is. So UDL is a foundational approach really to a lot of what we talk about in Don't Ditch That Tech. And so what this kind of framework originally started as was actually one for architecture. So architects and the work that was being done by CAST, you can see cast.org down there, fantastic organization, highly recommend you check them out, is that they were thinking about how can we make buildings more accessible for people who use them. And really what they then did is they took that idea and then they applied it to education. So like how can we represent things in multiple means? Like can we give like students more access with vocabulary and structure and thinking about how we give students access to background knowledge and those kind of things, right? Multiple means of action and expression. Do students have the ability to have agency and choice in terms of how they demonstrate, and how they demonstrate their learning, how they, gather their knowledge, those kind of things. And lastly, multiple means of engagement. So, looking at things like relevance and value and authenticity, they also talk about, good feedback and collaboration, these kind of things. And so what UDL really does for us is it gives us this kind of bottom line understanding that it's a lot about access, it's a lot about choice, and it's a lot about student empowerment. And that's really kind of the center of differentiation. Now, something I do want to mention just before we go on is that UDL is kind of like the background theory. The differentiation part, that word, is actually what we really do for students in the classroom. And I've always kind of thought of this as a funnel. So like UDL we do for, at least ideally, we should do for all of our students. But then when we actually start doing like accommodations and adaptations, that's when we really start like doing practical things on the ground, right? So like modifying content, process, product. We could be, modifying assessments. We could be changing procedures. But one other thing to note is that UDL, differentiation, we are not specifically equating those to SPED. And this is something that a lot of beginning teachers don't understand, is that when you get down to the SPED part of this realm, which is at the very bottom of the funnel, SPED, you're talking about changing the curriculum, the goals for particular students. That's a completely different animal, and really deserves a whole different level of, theory and analysis and time that we don't have to go into for this particular session. So anyways, with all that being said, let's carry on. So what is differentiation? It's a lot of different things. It can be, how I operate in the classroom. It can be a recognition of my students' various backgrounds. It can be, developing different, unique content and processes or ways that students can demonstrate their knowledge. It's going to depend on really your particular students, how you do differentiation. And so it's a lot of different things. Carolyn Tomlinson, who is an amazing writer and has done a lot of work around this, she was very, very kind to write a foreword, or not a foreword, but a kind of like a shout out for her book. She basically says this, is that it's modifying content, process, and products in response to the learning readiness and then the interests of our students. So at the end of this, why differentiate? It's really simple, because all of our students aren't the same, and we're trying to meet their needs wherever they might be. And now this kind of brings us to our book. So what were we trying to do? Well, when my co-authors, one is Matt Miller and then the other is my mom, we were really sitting down and trying to think about like where a lot of teachers are coming at right now. And we thought that for, teachers, there's two big challenges. One is all of these new apps that seem to be coming out all the time. There's always some new kind of TikTok app that we need to learn. And I'm sure in a year from now, that app will be like really old and there will be something new. And then the other thing is the greater awareness of student needs in the classroom. So it could be everything from trauma-informed education to English language learners, IEPs, 504s. We go on and on and on. And then, so with those things being the Usain Bolt that is running away from us, that's us teachers in the background not being able to keep up. And so we really sat down like in our book and we were like, man, like we don't have as teachers any kind of educational model for like teachers using technology in the classroom to meet their students' needs. And so that's really where the idea of the book was born from. So we have all these models for them. But what I'm going to encourage you to do is actually to pause this recording here for a second. And there is a survey. Again, it's a bit.ly right there that you can take. And you'll just type it into a separate tab in your web browser and take it. And what this is actually going to do is this is going to somewhat differentiate the rest of this particular presentation for you. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. When you click on or when you open up the bit.ly and you do it, a couple of things to note. Number one, it asks for your email. Number one, I will never ever send you anything. The only reason why we do that is because if you happen to submit it early without some other stuff that I'm about to talk about, it'll send you a copy. Second, be careful because on the last page, where it's asking you about some different scale questions, 1 to 4, you need to be careful of the labels because they do switch. So there's like agree, disagree, that kind of stuff. Before you hit submit, and this is the last thing, you need to add up the points on that last page of the survey, and it tries to kind of warn you. Okay, so there will be like 1, 4, 3, 2, 4, 3, etc., etc., and you want to add that up before you hit submit. we're going to use that number here in a few slides. So again, if you need to, pause this recording, type in the bit.ly, and then you can join me here as I continue on. So our model for tech and differentiation looks like this. And up at the top, you can see it kind of goes, it kind of works its way down. And our idea behind the model was that the more you go down, the more intensive and the more student-centered it gets. So up at the very top, okay, kind of more teacher-centric, down below, more student-centered. And then what we did, and this is where your points from that survey are going to come into use, is we turned each of those levels of the model into an archetype that kind of helps you understand how you might tend to differentiate with technology in the classroom. So let's take a moment, let's break these down. The pilot uses teacher-led technology in the classroom. So this is stuff like PowerPoint, or what I'm doing for you right now, right? It's where I'm in control of where this thing is going. You can't stand up and be like, hey, Mr. Ridgway, I'd like to go to Fiji instead. No, that's not happening, right? Then down below, the tech is becoming interactive, and we call this archetype the museum exhibitor. So if you go to a modern day museum, many of the things they have now are playable. But what this is kind of like is this is like you using technology in the classroom, like Kahoot, okay? Or let's say, for example, quizzes might be another one. The thing about this is, yes, now the technology is playable, but I'm still the one in charge of curating the museum. I decide how you interact with it. I decide the content that's inside that museum. You just get a way to play with it, right? Then down below, we start to get more student-centered. The restaurant owner. And the restaurant owner is really deciding, how they want they're thinking about more creative ways about how their students could consume or eat that content, right? Now, I still get to decide what's on the menu in terms of the content itself, but the students are not having choice about the process of how they learn and consume that knowledge. For our council members, which is the next one down, now we're giving students more input, more voice, and the actual content themselves. And then for that score for 35 to 40, we call that the creative art coach, where students are really driving the content. And the big thing about that too is they're getting critical quality feedback from their educator. And so we kind of get this really, really powerful kind of cycle that goes on there. Awesome. So once you kind of understood that model and where you might fit in it, one last thing before we dive into some particular areas and talking about differentiation. Number one, differentiation is a continuum. So there's going to be parts of your lesson where you're going to differentiate much more heavily and much more student-centric than you are others. And that's okay. And there's also going to be times where you're much more teacher-centric, and that's okay too. Second thing is that your differentiation is going to be completely varied upon what your students need at that particular time. It could be based upon the content that you're doing. It could be, based upon how rigorous the skills are that you're trying to teach students, and that's okay too. Differentiation is a journey, it's a continuum, and we're just somewhere along that at any given particular time. All right. So we are going to go on to this session guide slide. And if you're following on the bit.ly that was available back here, again, it's bit.ly/E_LCC 2020. This is slide, I believe, 16. Now, everything from slide 16 on is clickable and playable. The area that we did in our session was apply the real world, but I'm going to be doing all four here. Okay, and I'll play around with a few examples, try to show you a few things. But if you would like to go into any more of these areas in depth, that is absolutely your prerogative. Please feel free, explore, steal, etc., etc. So right here, activate attention. So we're going to start with this one first, and then kind of play around with a few things, maybe give you some time to think, and kind of process how you might be able to use this in your classroom. Oh yes, and one last thing. Before we go into any of these areas, the tendency is that I'm going to probably show you lots and lots of things that you may or may not have known, depending on your background. Don't get overwhelmed with them. Think about in your classroom, the next time you're teaching, trying one small thing, maybe for 15 minutes with one group of kids, and see if it works, see if it makes a difference. Don't feel like you have to do everything all at once, because your students are going to get overwhelmed, you're going to get overwhelmed, and it's probably not going to work well. But all that aside, attention and learning. It's absolutely essential. We have to keep our students not only engaged, but when we we have to get our students engaged, but not only that, we have to sustain that, right, throughout our time with them. Now, Atkinson and Schifrin, if you're familiar, Schifrin with their work on the information processing model, this should kind of look familiar if you've taken, an ed psych class. And basically what we're going to be working on here is this area kind of with sensory memory, but then kind of getting into working memory as well. And that's really grabbing our kids. And then eventually we'll talk about doing some stuff with elaboration and organization and helping our students be able to retrieve that information meaningfully. But what can be some creative ways that we can take our students' attention captive? First, let's talk about personalization. So I teach history, but this can be done in any particular area, finding a place or a topic that holds personal meaning for your students. And so right here is our example in this yellow highlight of something that I did with my kids. And so what I did is I took the example of Indiana, because that's where I teach, and Indiana was the first state to have a comprehensive eugenics law in the book. And so I do, when we're learning about social Darwinism and Victorianism in my U.S. history class, we look at this local example of Indiana. My students are blown away with the fact that that Indiana was actually deciding who could and who could not reproduce. Now, the app here is not complicated. It's just Google Slides, but it's the way that I'm using it that is really, really powerful for my students and grabs their attention. Okay, and again, this is an example you can dive into on your own time for really jumping into and looking about how you could apply it in your own class. The next one, pop culture, is Twitter moments. So a lot of educators are very, very scared, and rightfully so, using Twitter in their classroom. Why Twitter moments are awesome is because it allows us to curate particular things on Twitter. Okay, so here's one back from 2019. People show off their socks on World Down Syndrome Day. And so what the people did is they looked at, like a picture of chromosomes on just a trisomy. And just a very trisomy, a very, very kind of just scientific picture. And then they're like, oh, like what if we, rocked mismatched socks? And people took that and turned it into a really cool day. And it's awesome that this could be something that you might kind of celebrate with your particular group of students. Now, making one of these Twitter moments is not hard. It's actually really, really easy. And there's a tutorial there that we show you how you can make your own. The wonderful thing about Twitter moments is that when you go and you make yours, and again, the tutorial is there, is that you can go in and you can search by hashtag, you can search by user, you can just search tweets generally. And then when you put them all into that Twitter moment, your students don't see anything that is not like in that. So it's very curated, it's very safe, and it still feels like for students that you're bringing in voices from across the world, which is awesome. Mystery. Wonderopolis is awesome. Love Wonderopolis. So Wonderopolis, especially if you teach like grades K through 5, is wonderful. And Wonderopolis, what it does is it takes wonders that students, teachers, etc. submit, and then it curates them. So, for example, you can see this one, who was Sojourner of Truth, but then we always ask this one, which is peanut butter. That we always use this example in our presentations. And there was this wonder that apparently some student must have submitted: can you turn peanut butter into a diamond? And what's awesome about Wonderopolis is that it really does focus on wonders and like mystery, which is great. And I love it too in terms of the accessibility because of this button right here, which is Immersive Reader. And so if you have English language learners or students who need more assistance with processing the text, right here, if I click Immersive Reader, I can have this read for my students. Not only that, I can have it break it down by syllables. If I click on a word like peanut, it will, if I give it a second here, actually pop up with like a visual dictionary for them. It's great. And the other thing that I love about this is that it's got videos, it's got good academic, like rigorous vocabulary that, like it's got definitions right there for them. It's awesome. So that's Wonderopolis. I also do, in terms of these other areas, I'd recommend checking out Smithsonian Reader, which I'll actually talk about here in just a minute. News ELA, Newsella is kind of a similar option as well, if you're familiar with that. Newseum is awesome. Mythbusters Jr. and Adam Ruins Everything are also great. Okay, so that's what we have for activating attention. In terms of applying the real world, this area is kind of along the same track. Again, like, making information engaging for students, but what we're really focusing on here is relevancy. And the reason why is because it's about promoting students' intrinsic motivations. With that going on, let's talk about some different areas. And this is where we really have tried to differentiate the presentation for you depending on that score that you got on that survey. So for pilots, we've recommended Smithsonian Reader. So perhaps you've heard of Newsella. If you use Newsella and you love it, awesome, good for you. But if you don't have Newsella and you want a free alternative that's really, really good, I'd recommend Smithsonian Reader. And so what Smithsonian Reader does is it also goes by the name Tween Tribune, is it takes historical readings. It could be about, or it could be even up-to-date stuff, news, science, sports, education, culture, readings, etc. And then you can differentiate them with a single click based on Lexile level, which is awesome. So let's see right here. Birds making their annual trek north. If I wanted to differentiate that for different Lexile levels, it literally just takes a single click, which is great. I can assign it with Google Classroom. If I don't want to use it online, I can print these off. I can send them out. Just if I click this right here, this is technically a different link. It's a different URL than the 120, 1,220 Lexile. Which means that if I send this out to students, I avoid stigma as well, which is great. It's good academic rich vocabulary. There's also a Spanish section, and it's not like Google translated Spanish. It's like actual good quality Spanish. Now, the readings aren't the same as the ones in English, but they are good quality, which I particularly enjoy because my mom is a Spanish teacher, and so not having something that's Google translated is wonderful. Other than that, Google Earth and YouTube are always good options if you're a pilot. Let's talk about FET-SIMS. So FET-SIMS is actually put together, I believe, by the University of Colorado, but I may have that source incorrect. There's another app that's out there which is kind of similar called Gizmos. I like FET-SIMS. It's put together by the University of Colorado Boulder because it's free. And it's also much more accessible for students in a whole bunch of different ways that we'll get into. So it's math and science simulations. So again, talking about our restaurant owners being a little bit more, museum exhibitors being a little bit more interactive. I can click play with a sim, and then it could be anything in science. We could be, I want my students to learn how waves work at home. And so we just hit play here on the simulation. And then I can have my students learn about frequency, amplitude, wave speed, all from home. And the awesome thing about this as well is that these simulations are available in like 80-something languages. So let's do water. And then I can have my students begin to actually learn about this. So we'll turn on the water. Okay, and then we can play around with frequency and amplitude and all these things. And I can slow these down if I wanted to, which is great. So there you go. And now I can actually start to play around with these particular simulations. Awesome. All right, so there you go. That's FET-SIMS. I highly encourage you to check them out. They're wonderful. They're very, very responsive as well if you need assistance or other things like that. Cool. Flipgrid. Flipgrid is very, very well known in terms of apps out there. Highly recommend, if you are a restaurant owner or any of these roles, that you check them out. I'm not going to go into too much depth with them because they are really well known. But if you need assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. I can show you some ways that you can kind of curate, as a restaurant owner, give your students a menu of options as to how they might kind of process their learning. ThingLink is kind of like a choice board. So if you're a council member and you're wanting your students to have some choice as to the content that they are, voting on doing, ThingLink is a really easy to use choice board. Now it's free to use. It's kind of like one of these like freemium apps where there's lots of free options, but then there's some things you have to pay for. I've always gotten away with the free version. But if, for example, if I'm teaching the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, I can have my students choose from these different options, and then they can go and explore them. Now, a question that I often get is, wait, doesn't that mean my students are learning different things? Yes, it does. But that's the awesome thing about it, is my students actually get input on what they want to learn. And the good news is that, like, for nearly all areas in education, our standards are written so vaguely that my students could do multiple different things of content and still hit the same objective and learning standard that we're trying to accomplish in that particular class. And then lastly, the last one is dot storming. Dot storming is not as well known, but I love it for kind of a creative art coach kind of role. And the reason why is because what you do, and why it's called dot storming, is we have these little cards that students can make, or you can make them. In my case, for this particular example, I made them. And then I had my dual credit U.S. History students actually jump in and do the voting. And this is where the dot storming magic happens. So what you do in a dot storm is you have all these cards, right? I could have put pictures in them. I could have had students comment on them if I wanted to, or, reflect. But what I had them do is vote on the objectives that they would most like us to study up until the days that we were about to do a final. And down here, you can see all these little dots that are all over the screen. And that's where students have voted for whichever objectives they wanted us to study. And at the very end of their voting, I could go down here and hit this button, rank by votes. And when that happens, boom, I could instantly prioritize the areas that my students wanted to study. Now, there's 1,000 different things you can do with a dot storm, which is why it kind of really fits into this creative art coach role well. But something to note is that you only get 2 boards for free with the free version. So what I do is I just always go back and delete the old ones that I'm not using anymore. So there you go. There's some other good ones that I'd also recommend, but for the sake of time, I'll leave those for you to explore. All right. Applying to real world, we're all done with that. There's also a slide here that I put on other ways that you might use Flipgrid, because it is so ridiculously flexible in terms of how you use it. But let's carry on to our next area. Okay. So we are now going to hit our third one, which is personalizing content. Now, for most teachers, when they think differentiation, this is what they think of, creating varied personalized content experiences. And I think that there's a very common assumption that this can be very time consuming. It can be confusing, and it feels like you have to make 80,000 versions of a lesson plan. And it doesn't have to be. Technology can make this really fast, and it can save you a lot of time and heartache. So let's dive into some ways to do this. Okay, you're going to notice that a lot of what we're going to be dealing with this area is a lot of active pre-planning. So it's things that we do before the class even starts. And not only that as well, just kind of a forewarning here, is that this area is going to probably focus on more the restaurant owner, council member, creative art coach area. So if you are a pilot or a museum exhibitor, think of this as like a time where you could pull like one area, you could experiment and grow, something you could test. If you're more in the restaurant owner, council member, creative art coach area, this is like a time where you can add one more thing to your toolkit that you might try next time, right? Okay, so differentiating content with 5 apps. So we have 5 of our personal favorites here, at least for me and Mom. And I'm just going to kind of hit over these 5 as quickly as I can with talking about some other really, really powerful features. So class time is what I use for quick, rapid fire assessments. If you click right there, that will give you several, I think it's like 2 or 3 months of premium for free. But what class time does, and I will show you here real quick, is that it allows me to gather data from my students really, really fast, which then I can use in turn to make more decisions about how I'm going to differentiate my content. So right here, you can see that I've got a library. You can see I've got a bunch of questions. Now, this is an app that's kind of similar in some ways, if like you use like a Socrative or, things like that. But what I love about it is how flexible it is and how quick I get information. So right here, right, let's say I want to do a quick formative assessment on the first industrial revolution with my students. I'm going to start a session with them. And this is where we get a lot of options right off the bat. If I want to give this as an assessment, I can shuffle answer options, I can shuffle questions, all these kind of typical things. But then there's some other stuff that I love as well. Like I can set a timer for the session. I can schedule it at a particular time so that it's only open at certain times for students, like it closes down, those kind of things, which is why one reason I like this better than Google Forms, besides it, I get the data faster. Anyways, let's just proceed as if we're doing this in actual session. So what it's going to look like for you as a teacher is like this. And so as my students start to fill out the information, I get this data back in real time, which is awesome because then I can make quick decisions about how I need to meet my particular students' needs in my classroom. And as you can see here with our students, I can go in and I can break it down by questions. So I can click right here and I can see, okay, 47% of my students don't understand, or do understand, that the Industrial Revolution was a shift from human to machine power. Awesome. Great. I can highlight and I can see which students don't understand that, which is nice, or might have misconceptions. But there's all different types of questions on here. I could ask like a very open-ended answer. What causes the first industrial revolution? The cool thing about this is if I have students do like a short response back to me, is that class time will remember which answers that I click as correct and which ones I click as wrong, and it will auto-grade all future sessions that I do with students, so that can save me some awesome grading time of having to like not go back through and like manually click right or wrong, right or wrong, right or wrong. Okay. Class time also has some other different types of answers too. And so this is a hotspot question. And so I gave this question, click the country where the first industrial revolution started. And so my students would have to actually physically click on England, right, in order to get the question correct. Now, what I do beforehand is I just kind of like mark this area as the area that students have to click. But the wonderful thing about this is like let's take biology, right, where I can click the organ of the human body that's responsible for pumping blood. I could have all this organs on the human body, and then I could see students visual answers. So I love this option because it does give more flexibility. There's true false, there's grids, all this good kind of stuff that you can use, and sending it out to students is super easy, which I love as well. I can just send them out this URL right here, which I can copy. If I've got littles, I can copy, I can save this QR code and I can just print it and then they can scan it and they're in. Because we all know that with littles, like having them try to type in 7 or 6 letters in a row and do it correctly for login is a disaster, and that's really, really difficult. So there you go. That's class time. I love it. I've used it in my classroom for about 3 or 4 years now, and it's great. IORAD. So IORAD's really, really cool. So what IORAD does, if you are again, thinking about how we can differentiate and personalize the learning process for kids, is an interactive tutorial maker. Now, it is just a Google extension for Chrome, or you can even get it for desktop if you wanted to. It's free, but there are some like premium features that are nice to have if you really want to go for it. I just use the free version, but again, up to you. And I will just show you what a tutorial looks like. And so this is IORAD right here. Okay. And to make these, I just kind of like, I like to think of it this way. If I'm ever trying to teach a process, like step-by-step thing in my classroom, right? So like, go like do this, then click here, then go to that. I always remember like going to a computer lab, like as a kid, and my teacher would send me screenshots, right? And like, it may be screenshots if they're real sophisticated, but like there would be steps, right? This takes that, but it actually has the student interactively do the steps. Okay, so it's kind of like, imagine if your screencasts of like telling parents like what to do were more interactive and playable. So right here, notice by the way, I can translate these into dozens of languages with Google Translate, which is awesome. And I'm just gonna hit start. And this is the one that I made for my kids the other day.
Complete the warm-up by clicking on the right
this
block.
would be playing audio if I have the audio option on. And it would read it to them. And it says, complete the warm-up by clicking on the right block. So I click. They would click on the right warm-up.
Watch the video.
Here. Watch the video. So they actually have to sit there and watch the video.
Read today's
on the
objectives.
Next slide, read today's objectives. They read the objectives. Right? They go
complete the Google Map activity.
Complete the Google Map activity. Click here. And so it really gives them, like, they actually have to do the steps that they would really do in the classroom. There's a couple of questions that people have with this. Number one, how long do these take to make? After you've made your first or second one, 5 minutes, maybe. And then you can share them with links. You can embed them. You can assign them in Google Classroom. You can put them in any LMS that you want to do. They're great. And the thing is that this really helps make learning and with like process types, like things, like way more accessible. So for example, like let's say that you are trying to teach a parent how to log into Canvas for the first time. Send them an IORAD tutorial. Or you're like, I have subplans and I want to make sure my kids know what to do when I'm gone. Here you go. Let's say I'm doing lab stations. I want my kids to know what to do when they, when they get to the stations. Here you go. And that's IORAD. It's wonderful. I've used it now for about 3 years and it's great. It's very, very easy to use. They're very responsive. They're a great group and great organization. I highly recommend them. So there you go. That's IORAD, and it is it's a criminally underknown really ed tech app out there. Google Drawing. So differentiating content with 5 apps. Google Drawings are third, probably better known than IORAD or ClassTime. But Google Drawing is like one of the most flexible Google apps out there. This is one that I made for my particular students, and they had to make a timeline on theirs. And this is just one example of a Google Drawing. I've had students take Google Drawings and use them as graphic organizers. I've had them do them as like think, pair, share, like worksheets, because again, you can share a drawing with, from student to student. One thing I love doing with these Google Drawings is, let's say, for example, I give an assignment out there. I can just make a GIF of how to actually do the particular assignment. And I'll talk about some other alternatives for, making assignments more available and content more accessible. But there you go. Google Drawing, extremely flexible. There's some really, really powerful tutorials on how to use that, and as well that I would love to link to and more to talk about, but for the sake of time, I'll continue on. All right. Insert Learning. So Insert Learning is amazing. I'm actually going to go to the Insert Learning website here. So it's just at insertlearning.com. Insert Learning actually has a really good GIF on their site of what it does. So you make Insert Learning it's a simple Chrome extension download, and what it does is very much of what's on that line there. Insert instructional content on any web page. So let's say, for example, there's a news article. It could be a published Google Doc. It could be anything that's online. I can take that and then I can embed questions, comments, drawings, links to YouTube videos, those kind of things, and I can scaffold that content for my students. What's amazing is that it also records, like if I want my students, and you can see they're like, insert a question, have them summarize something. When they do that, when the students would summarize, it then sends those students' answers to me. So it's kind of like Edpuzzle in that way, when, students like actually respond in the app. What's also great is, let's say that I make an insert learning about a news article that students are reading. I can make a copy of that lesson and then take that exact same duplicate copy, and then I can add a few, bits of scaffolds, maybe remove some. This is a technique that's common that we recommend for many, many apps out there. Google Apps, you can do that. Insert Learning, Google Drawing, class time sessions. You go on and on and on and on. But we call it copy, paste, mutate. So you copy it, you make paste, you make an identical copy, and then you just add a few mutations. Maybe you take away some scaffolds or add some, and there you go. It's wonderful, and it's also free. So that is Insert Learning. There you go. The last ones are Choose Your Own Journey Stories. Choose Your Own Journey Stories. This is just a sample right here, and the reason I linked you out to this is because I've got a template here that you can use yourself, and then as well as a tutorial about how you can make your own. If you don't know what Choose Your Own Journey Stories are, these are the things like when you went to the library as a kid, and it was like, turn to page 25 if you want to go into the cave. Turn to page 26 if you don't. And of course, I always made the wrong one and died. So there you go. But what I do in my classroom is I have students use them in history. And I love it because it makes history so interactive and playable. And it is something that I really enjoy, having my students be able to have history be interactive and immersive. So there's 3 examples of stories that we've done in the past. Eventually, I get to the point where I have students making these, and some just choose to do so because that's one way they can demonstrate their knowledge. So there you go. Choose Your Own Journey Stories. They're awesome. And you make them in Google Slides. And again, don't freak out. I know this has been a lot so far, but it's small steps and small things that we can do. The last area that we're going to be talking about in this presentation is promoting metacognition. So metacognition is really, really important. And obviously, but the reason is because it's the idea of students taking over the differentiation for themselves. And we have this quote that we kind of used in our book and elsewhere. The ultimate goal is not to become a teacher who can differentiate, but to develop children who can differentiate for themselves. So this is for our creative art coaches out here, really the way that we can take differentiation to the next level. And we have 3 apps that we would recommend you might try. The first is for goal setting, which is a part of metacognition. Having students model, create, gather, and reflect on goals is just a Google form. And this is a template right here that you can use yourself. On this Google form, you can just take it and steal it. Just copy, paste. And what is your name? Select one of the following options. I haven't started on my project. I've made some progress, right? So I have my students, and this is one I use with my class, actually take some time to think about and do themselves. And that's just a very, very simple Google form. With chunking, I have something here called VoiceThread. Now, VoiceThread is a little bit better known. It's actually a little bit of an older EdTech app, but I love it because it takes chunking and it really allows students to break down knowledge very, very procedurally. So how VoiceThread works is test that you have like a single piece of media, right? So right here, this is technically a math limerick, and I could have my students break this down step by step with all these different comment functions. And the comment functions are various. It won't let me do it right now because I'm not logged in. But I could have students make video comments. I could have them make text comments on it. And then if I wanted to have them go on to like another piece, like another limerick, another piece of poetry, I could have them do the same thing, and they can kind of break it down step by step. VoiceThread is free, but it's kind of, again, one of those like freemium apps. There's lots and lots of apps that are out there to help our students chunk information. And again, VoiceThread here just being our particular example. Self-regulation. We mentioned Penzu here as having giving students an ability to turn productive thinking and actions over to themselves. The reason why we mentioned Penzu is because Penzu is kind of like an online diary of sorts. But the reason why we mention it is because it's like it's kind of like a word processor / diary that's not linked to Microsoft or Google. And the reason why is because oftentimes what happens is after our students graduate, they lose access to those email accounts that were associated with like Microsoft Docs or Google Docs. And so this is an alternative. Now, students don't have to share this with you if they don't want to. They could just write it in private and then share bits and pieces, but they can continue to return to this and use it as a method for self-regulation. There's also some other ones that we would love to mention, like Emotionary, Middle School Confidential, Padlet, Answer Garden. We go on and on and on and on. But those are really the four main areas that we wanted to talk about today. So lots of things discussed today about how you might differentiate with your students. If you would like to get in contact with me in the future and look, or my mom or Matt, and look at some of the work that we've done, you can check out our blog, which is right here at teachingfromtheridge.com. We try to blog, every as much as we can with current events going on. And we have lots more on there about how you can differentiate. As well, of course, we would love you forever if you might check out our book, Don't Ditch That Tech, which is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other good places where you might get your books. With that being said, thank you so much for joining me during this session. I know that was a lot of information, but I hope it's something that you can take, even just one small thing, and use it in your classroom in the future. So with that being said, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.